I have had athletes run as fast as Mbappe, deadlift 600 pounds, and score professional hat tricks. And in this video, I'm going to teach you the secrets of their training that help them become elite level athletes so that you can use them and stand out on the pitch as well. I'm going to take 10 years of pro footballer training experience and distill it down into one video. Now we're going to cover a wide variety of topics today, and I hope you stay through the whole video because you may discover that you are doing something wrong that you didn't even know about, or you may discover a new training topic that you didn't even know about. And I'm going to keep these Q&As coming, so if you do have a question for me, make sure to drop it below and I will make sure to get to it in the next video. But let's get into it right away here. Question number 1, what kind of sprints are good for soccer/footballers? Now, if you followed me on social media at all, you've heard me talk about hard versus soft start sprints. But I'm going to give you 3 different things that you can use to make sure that you are utilizing these properly. First things first, it's not that hard or soft start sprints are better or worse. The big thing that you need to understand is hard starts are going to be better for people who are maybe weaker, they lack force production, or they just want to work on their acceleration. Then soft starts are going to be better for people who are in season and get high minutes. They're going to be better for people who want to work top speed, and maybe they're already plenty strong. But how do we actually create these things? The number one thing that we can do to make an exercise hard versus soft start is ranges of motion of the starting positions. So for a hard start exercise, we're going to use deeper ranges of motion at the ankle, knee, and hip. And for soft starts, we're going to use short ranges of motion. So an example of a hard start starting position would be a full kneeling hard start sprint. And then an example of a soft start starting position would be like a short range of motion split stance falling start. And again, it's not that you should do one or the other, but being able to understand how to use each of these based on the time of season you're in, based on your weak points, based on your goals, that is what is truly important. The second way that we can create hard or soft start sprint positions is going to be by utilizing changes of direction. Now, hard start sprints require more force into the ground, which is exactly why they help people with acceleration and that first step quickness. Because of that, bigger changes of direction are going to make an exercise more towards the hard start end of the spectrum. So things that I consider hard starts are 180 degrees, 135 degrees, even 90 degrees. Then if we want to use a soft start change of direction, you're really only going to have the option of doing no change of direction at all or going 45 degrees. So the easiest way to understand this is if I had you do a exercise where you sprint 5 yards one way, then have to do a complete 180 and turn around and sprint the other way. That would be a hard start example. But if you wanted a soft start example, what you could do is I could just have you 1, do a regular sprint, or 2, I could have you sprint forward 10 yards and then do a 45-degree change of direction. Now, the third way where we kind of combine the last 2 rules is going to be by choosing the proper plyometric exercise to do before the sprint. If you're on my 30-day speed blueprint, you've seen a ton of plyometric exercises kind of pop up in there. And while it's not a main focus for us in that program, it is a way that we can manipulate this hard versus soft start aspect of sprinting. But which plyometrics then transfer over to hard start versus soft start? Well, as you can imagine, plyometrics with deeper ranges of motion and plyometrics that require higher amounts of changes of direction, those are going to be the harder starts, and vice versa for the soft starts. So an example of this would be like a deep range of motion broad jump where you then have to completely 180 degrees turn and sprint the other way after you land. That would be a really good hard start variation. And then a soft start would be like a forward bound in a small range of motion with 0 change of direction and then just sprinting forward. Now, the next question that we're going to get into here is what are the best ankle mobility exercises for soccer/footballers? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, there is no number 1 best exercise, but there is a best way to combine a bunch of different exercises into one ankle mobility or rehab program. First thing we need to understand is all the different positions that the ankle can get into. So if this is my ankle and if I point my toes up, that's going into dorsiflexion. Point them away, that is plantar flexion. If I'm facing forward, pointing the toes in is inversion. This is eversion. Then we have supination, and then we have pronation. So we have a bunch of different positions of the foot that we need to make sure to train. And for some of you, if you're doing this from a rehab perspective or a mobility perspective, you may only have one of those positions that's in particular tight or in particular like causes you pain. So maybe that's the only area that you need to tackle. But the thing that you need to understand is, number one, you need to train it isometrically. And for me, one of my favorite exercises to do this for is a split squat with a floating heel, just because this is a really good way that we can end up loading the ankle and the foot complex in a really heavy manner. Then we need to make sure that we train it dynamically. So we're gonna go with something like an inverted tiptoe walk. Then we need to train it through its deepest range of motion. We need to make sure that we're moving that ankle as much as we possibly can. And for this, we can do a single leg toe elevated wall acceleration calf raise. So last but certainly not least, make sure not to forget this last part. We need to train it fast, so this can turn into something like a triple ankle pogo to 180-degree turn broad jump. I think that last part is where so many people get it wrong, where they just completely forget the speed aspect of it, and then they go out onto the pitch and then they wonder why they have these recurring ankle injuries. We give so much credit to stretching and mobilizing and all these different things when it comes to injury prevention, but we don't talk about speed and being able to create some tissue tolerance at those higher speeds. Something to think about for you guys. Okay, this next one, some of you may hate me for, but what are your opinions on foam rolling, Bosu ball, balance board, and sand training for footballers? Now, the most important thing when it comes to all of this is if you do any of these things and you enjoy them and you feel like it makes you a better footballer or it just feels good to do, don't let me be the one, some random guy on social media, to tell you to not do these things. But if your reasoning is only because the pros do it, here is something to consider. Plenty of pros stay out late partying, they stay out late drinking, plenty of pros do crazy amounts of drugs, plenty of pros do all these things that are pretty objectively not optimal in terms of performance. Does that mean that you're going to do those things too? Because if you can't come up with an actual reason why these things are beneficial for you, and you're just blindly copying a pro, then you might as well blindly copy everything that they do. And I know that's an extreme example, but at the same time, with almost all of these things, I see no reason to be doing it. I do like foam rolling for me and my athletes, so I'm going to completely disregard that one. I just like doing it. Foam rolling is great. But when it comes to Bosu ball training and balance board and sand training for footballers, I don't see a reason to do it, and I'm going to explain why. The number 2 rule in sports performance behind just don't injure your athletes is specificity. And what I mean by that is if I want to get better at something, I need to get as close to doing that thing as possible for me to actually get better from it. And the farther away I get from that, the less benefit I'll get. So a really easy to understand example is if I'm practicing taking penalty kicks from 12 yards away, and if I practice taking 100 penalty kicks from 12 yards away, that's going to be really beneficial for me in terms of getting better at penalty kicks. But if I'm trying to get better at PKs and I start shooting from half field, not nearly as specific, I'll probably get a little bit better because I'm still working on just kicking a ball, but at the same time, I'm way farther away. I'm not really working on aiming at a particular corner of the goal. There's a lot of things that go wrong there. And the same thing is happening for the Bosu ball, the balance board, and sand training. And the reason for that is because we need to practice stabilizing and balancing and working our proprioceptive ability on the actual surface that we train on the pitch. So many of you say, oh yeah, but the Bosu ball and the balance board, all these things actually make it harder for my ankle to stabilize. So I'm strengthening my ankle, I'm strengthening all those ligaments, and I fully get why you're saying, but we can do all of those things on the actual surface that you practice and play on. And like the easiest way that we can do that is I can have you stand on one leg or in a split stance and do like a pal-off press for beginners. Then I can have you do a floating heel pal-off press. Then I can have you do some single leg balance while someone is actually bumping into you using an external stimulus. Those are just a bunch of really beginner examples, but you get what I'm saying. And then we're working on stabilizing, we're strengthening the joint and the foot in an actual position that it will see on the pitch. Then in terms of sand training, where that becomes a problem is because the sand actually shapes to your foot and it helps you absorb the force, the tendons and connective tissues that you use when running don't get trained as much when you're doing this. So not only are you going to run slower because you don't hit those same top speeds that you would if you were running on regular surface, but those tendons, those connective tissues, those muscles are not worked at hitting as high speeds as they would. So then when you do get onto the pitch and you are hitting higher speeds, they're at a greater risk of injury. I never want to be the guy that tries to start fear-mongering that like, oh, sand training is going to cause injuries or anything like that, especially if you're just out there juggling and having fun. Like, go ahead and do that. That's a great time. I've done it before too. But at the same time, if we're looking to optimize for making sure that you stay injury-free, that's definitely something that I would look at avoiding. And again, if you've heard all those things and you're like, I get it, but you know, I still really like it, I've done it my whole life, it makes me feel good, then great, go ahead. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to provide my perspective of training the highest level athletes for the past 10 years of my life what's worked for me, what's worked for them, but you need to do what works best for you. I'm not here for a debate. I'm here to just provide perspective. Next question. What is the most important thing when coming back from injury? Now, I can't give you the number one most important thing, but what I will do is I'll give you the 4 most important things. If you want to come back from injury, you want to start playing at the highest level as fast as you possibly can, and make sure that you never get injured again. Now, in my time playing football, I had almost every injury under the sun, and that's a main reason why I decided to get into soccer or football specific sports performance training, so I could reduce this for myself, and then I could help others actually make sure that they are performing at the highest levels at all times. And now I can confidently say that these injuries that used to happen to me all the time rarely, if ever, occur now. And this is exactly how I did it. Number 1 is when rehabbing, make sure that you kind of dial in that frequency of how often you're doing your rehab exercises. Now, every injury is going to be really different with this, and the frequency is probably going to change as you go through your rehab exercises. So like for me, I've had a knee and I've had a shoulder surgery. And when I first started my rehab, the frequency is really high because the exercises are so low stress and so low level that the body actually can handle doing them at higher frequencies. But then, for example, I made the mistake of utilizing that same amount of frequency during later stages of my rehab training for my back injury. So I was doing these way more intense exercises. They still weren't like super intense because I'm used to like real performance training, which is intense. I was doing high frequencies of submaximal sprinting and submaximal box jumps. And because I had been out from real training for so long, my body didn't have the ability to recover as quickly. So I was doing these more stressful activities, and then it just turned into this whole thing where my body wasn't recovering. And this late stage rehab of my back just really started to just take forever. But what I eventually found out was, okay, let's dial this into doing 2 days and then 1 day off, and then 2 days and 1 day off, or even some days, 1 day on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 1 day off, depending on how my body was recovering. So just find out what works for you. And overall, make sure that your pain does not increase 2 points from one day to another. So if I woke up on Monday and I had a 3 out of 10 level pain, and then I trained that day and woke up on Tuesday with a 6, I know that I did too much. I know I need to dial that back, and maybe I need to take a day off and just kind of let some things recover. The second thing you need to do if you want to recover from an injury and get back to playing at the highest level possible as quickly as possible, you need to start training slow, and then you need to progress it into fast. So from one end of the spectrum, we have isometric exercises, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have like a max speed sprinting. So for someone who had like a hamstring strain, the first thing I would have them do is just perfectly lay flat, tuck the hips underneath them, and just dig the heel down into the ground as hard as they can without inducing a ton of pain. And just hold that for like 10 to 30 seconds. Then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, I would start to get them into sprint training right before they actually get back to going out onto the pitch. So I'd have them do 50% max speed, 60, 70, you get the point, until we get out to 100%. The third thing that you need to do is you need to start with small ranges of motion and work your way up to deep ranges of motion. So one of the ways that I utilize this in my training is by doing deep-seated box jumps. And when I say deep-seated, I mean I would just sit as low as I possibly could without causing pain in my particular injury. And the seated box jump was really beneficial because I had just an objective number of like, okay, today I did 20 inches seated on the box. And then, you know, in a couple weeks, I'll go down to 18 or 16, and then just keep lowering and lowering and lowering while still doing a high speed exercise that was really beneficial for me in my late stage rehab. And then eventually, once I got to an incredibly deep seated box jump position, I then progressed myself into the sprints. The fourth and most important thing when it comes to rehab and coming back from an injury is do not come back until you are mentally prepared to come back. If you come back before your body feels ready to come back, I can almost guarantee that things are not going to go well for you. And the reason for that is because you probably don't feel mentally ready to come back because your body actually isn't ready to come back. I've had so many footballers come to me and say, oh yeah, I did all my rehab and I went back out onto the pitch and in a month I was injured again. And I talk them through and I'm like, okay, what was your rehab looking like? And almost every single time they didn't do any like end stage sprint rehab. So the first time they got out onto the pitch, they were doing sprinting, which they hadn't done in like 6 months. And they could feel as they were doing the sprints that they're like, oh, my body, this doesn't feel good, but I was told I'm ready, so I'm out here. And then they end up, you know, tearing a hamstring again or whatever it turned out to be. So if you are not ready to come back, talk to your coach, talk to your physio, talk to whoever you have to, but make sure that your body is actually ready to come back before you step foot onto the pitch. The next question that we have here is, what is the perfect running technique for footballers? Now, this is a good one. I really credit so much of why my 30-day speed blueprint works so well for footballers to the fact that we really focus on running mechanics. And during those running mechanics mechanics drills, we are really often looking for 90 degrees of hip flexion. Now, so much of sprinting is contextual to the actual activity that you are doing. And the higher that my knee goes when I'm in a sprint, the farther it has to travel down to actually hit the ground, which is what I obviously need to change directions, which is something that happens pretty often in a 360-degree field sport where everything is just incredibly unpredictable. Sometimes I'm sprinting 10 yards because the ball is over there, and then someone completely switches it to the opposite end of the field. And if my knees are really high up towards my chest, it's gonna take me just that little bit extra to actually change directions and go chase down whatever's happening on the other side. Kind of a bad example, but you get the point. I say all this to say, for these running mechanics drills, I like to hit 90 degrees of hip flexion because that is the actual best way for us to hit max top speeds. But then if you get onto the pitch and maybe you record yourself and you watch yourself run and you're like, oh man, my knees just don't get as high on the pitch, that's perfectly fine. Because what you're doing is you're solving for the actual problem that you have in the moment, which is, okay, there's a lot of stuff happening where I need to change a bunch of different directions. So your body naturally is like, okay, I have to keep my feet a little bit closer to the ground so I can quickly hit it and change direction and completely redirect my force. The only time where 90 degrees of hip flexion is really just absolutely perfect when it comes to sprinting is if like a ball is played over the top and you're the attacker or you're the defender and it's really just you versus him and you know exactly where that ball is going to end up, so it's just a max sprint. You just need to get there as fast as you can. And I know what you're thinking already, so why do you have people do 90 degrees of hip flexion when it comes to running mechanics if that's not what we actually do oftentimes on the pitch? And number one is because oftentimes you are getting really close to 90 degrees, you're getting like 75 or 80. And number two is because that 90 degrees will help you hit your physiological max speed of sprinting, which is incredibly important when it comes to training for top speed. Because if I want to get you faster, I need you running as fast as you possibly can, as frequently as you possibly can. The second thing that you need to do if you want to have the perfect running technique for football is work on where you strike the foot. Now, there are 3 different spots that the foot can strike. If this is your body and you are traveling that way, you can strike the foot behind you, beneath you, or in front of you. Now, the Fashion Nature boys are going to absolutely hate this one. But if you strike the foot behind you, you're creating more horizontal force and you're traveling forwards. If you strike the foot beneath you, you're creating more vertical force, but because you already accelerated and you're traveling that way, that vertical force isn't going to send you straight up into like a jump or something. And then if you strike the foot in front of you, which is the one the Fashion Nature boys absolutely hate, you're going to travel backwards more. You're going to start to decelerate yourself. And sad news is that is actually something you really need to train. And if you don't, if you pretend that's just a position that doesn't exist, you're going to be at a really, really high risk of injury in comparison to people who do train it. So again, striking the foot behind you is acceleration focused. Striking the foot directly beneath you is more top speed focused. And then striking the foot in front of you is more deceleration focused. So as long as your foot is striking in the proper position for what you are trying to work on, that's what matters. But if you're trying to do max speed and your foot is striking in front of you, that is just going to increase the amount of time that you spend on the ground. It's going to slow you down. It's going to put your hamstrings at a really significant risk because those hamstrings are going to be on length and it's going to be stretched when it's hitting really high speeds. And there's just a bunch of different things that can go wrong if that's what happens for you. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you got something out of it. Please let me know in the comments if you have anything that you want me to answer in the next Q&A. But until then, make sure to subscribe, make sure to like the video. Please support the channel so I can pump more of these videos out for you guys, and I will see you next time.